original Turok trilogy is, for the most part, a great set of games that I think should be regarded as classics. Despite a few flaws, they are supremely enjoyable, and with Night Dive Studios having remastered all three, now is a better time than ever to get into this boomer shooter franchise. And in this video, we're going to take a look at these three games with an emphasis on their design, gameplay, aesthetics, strengths, and weaknesses, starting with the very first entry. Originally developed by Iguana Entertainment and published by Acclaim, the Turok series was initially kicked off in the year 1997 for the N64, and was also ported to Microsoft Windows. Turok Dinosaur Hunter was the title of this first entry, and in this game you play as Tal Set, a Native American warrior whose purpose is to protect Earth from threats that inhabit a place called the Lost Land. His burden is that given to the Turok, a title that is passed down from generation to generation. The Lost Land is inhabited by all manner of hostiles, including dinosaurs, giant bugs, mercenary types, tribal natives, and later in the game, even robots and aliens. There are a handful of boss fights as well, and these bosses do tend to put up a pretty good fight. Turok goes pretty crazy with the enemy variety, and there are even Triceratops with mounted rocket launchers, just to give an example of how out there the enemy designs are in Turok. It's also worth noting that there are some nice violent touches to the enemy animations, like when they grab their necks as they bleed out. Fortunately, the crazy variety isn't limited to enemy types, as the weapon variety is pretty nuts as well. There is a knife, bow, pistol, pump-action shotgun, and what seems to be an AK-47 that you put to great use early in the game. But this is followed up with an auto shotgun that is very effective, and is made even more effective with explosive shells. Speaking of explosives, the bow also has an alternate ammunition in the tech arrows, which also explode upon impact, and are great at short to medium range. Continuing on with the explosive combat options, there is also a grenade launcher, which is great fun, especially when you launch raptors into the stratosphere, and eventually a multi-rocket launcher. Beyond that, there is the tried and true boomer shooter staple, the minigun, as well as several energy weapons, including the pulse rifle, which fits the plasma rifle archetype. I wouldn't say that combat is all that challenging in Turok, but it is very fast, which is helped mostly by the fact that you move very quickly in this game. And there are several moments in Turok when you can mow down one enemy after another, and the feeling of going on an absolute rampage is fantastic. What is probably the most challenging aspect of Turok's gameplay is actually the platforming, of which there is a lot of. It's to the point where Turok can easily be labeled as an FPS platformer. Most of the platforming isn't too much of a struggle, but there are certainly a few sections that can be quite challenging, but also rewarding. There are even platforming challenge rooms that can be accessed by portals that temporarily reveal themselves at certain locations. And these rooms contain rewards such as extra life points, health, armor, and ammo. This is a classic boomer shooter through and through, and this is apparent in the aforementioned fast movement speed, the lack of reloading, the enemy variety, and the abundance of secrets to find. And exploration might just be the most important aspect of Turok, as this is core to the game's design. You see, at the center of the campaign's 8 levels is a hub area, with portals leading to each zone. Each level contains a certain number of keys that are used to unlock the other portals, so finding these keys is paramount. Level design is solid for the most part, with the exception of the catacombs, which I found to be quite confusing on this most recent playthrough, simply because I failed to step on a stone that activated a drain. However, this confusion should be a rare occurrence in Turok, as I have found level navigation to be pretty easy for a vast majority of the experience. Levels are also constantly being repopulated by enemies that spawn in, but they will often drop health and ammo pickups that keep everything pretty balanced, at least on the normal difficulty. Which reminds me that on the higher difficulties, these health and ammo spawns go from rare to non-existent. I don't really care for this approach to the difficulty because it essentially makes speedrunning the most viable option. With enemies constantly respawning and no way of refilling your ammo reserves, it's better to just avoid fighting enemies entirely, especially on the hardcore difficulty, which is a problem in a game about shooting things. And that would probably be my biggest critique of the first game. Also, since this was primarily a console shooter, quick saves are not an option, but there are checkpoints, save stations, and an extra life system that work pretty well together. Moving on to the next game in the trilogy, Turok 2: Seeds of Evil was released in October of 1998, a year that also saw the releases of Half-Life and Unreal. Turok 2 plays similarly to the first game in that there is a hub area where various levels are accessed from, 6 in this game, and you run through each level collecting keys that unlock other levels, including the Primogen keys, which can be difficult to locate at times, and these unlock the final boss fight. Oftentimes, Primogen keys can only be accessed once new traversal options have been unlocked by finding sacred feathers and placing them on pedestals that are found at the other end of warp portals. These traversal options include the ability to swim through toxic water, a long jump of sorts, and the ability to ride the wind, just to name a few, which kind of gives Turok 2 more of a Metroidvania aspect to its gameplay. Other warp portals lead to Flesh Eater spaceships, the Flesh Eaters being an antagonistic alien race that shows up for the first time in this game. And at the end of these sections, a piece of the nuke weapon can be picked up. Collect all of these pieces and you have the most powerful weapon in the game, which makes the final boss much easier to deal with, which is similar to the Chronoscepter power weapon that is acquired through secret hunting in the first game. Aside from this, there are also objectives that must be completed before finishing each level, which is somewhat reminiscent of the objective-based design of a game like Quake 2. It also cannot be understated just how much more violent Turok 2 is than the first game. It's not uncommon for a headshot from any weapon to blow an enemy's head clean off, and most monsters die while spurting gallons of blood seemingly from their neck or from areas where limbs used to be. This just makes the gunplay feel even more impactful, and yes, it is very satisfying. Speaking of gunplay, there are so many weapons on offer in Turok 2. How many? Well, try 26. Yeah, it's pretty insane. I'll admit that not every weapon gets a ton of use for me, but most of them are very powerful and fun to put to the test. There are some returning weapons from the first game, such as the bow and arrows, tech bow and tech arrows, the pistol, the rocket launcher, and the grenade launcher. In addition to this, the regular and explosive shotgun shells make a return. However, this time, the pump-action shotty from Turok 1 is replaced by a double-barreled beast, and there is also a new shotgun known as the Shredder, which has the benefit of shotgun shells that explode into pellets that ricochet all over the place. There is also a new pistol variant, the Mag 60, that fires in bursts and has a lot of weight to it, that can be felt with every shot, especially headshots. And beyond that, the minigun is replaced by the Firestorm cannon, which uses plasma energy as ammunition, as does the new plasma rifle, which this time behaves more like the Gauss cannon from Doom 2016, as this is a semi-automatic weapon with a powerful single shot, and the ability to scope in and snipe enemies from afar. Other weapons are the flamethrower, as well as some melee and even underwater options. My favorite weapon in the entire game, though, would have to be the cerebral bore, which sends out a tracking projectile that launches onto an enemy's skull and bores into their brain, causing their brain to then explode, which is a great example of the violent animations that I mentioned previously. I also cannot talk about Turok 2's weapons without mentioning a specific section at the beginning of the second level. Remember those Triceratops with the mounted rocket launchers from the first game? Yeah, you get to ride one in Turok 2, and it's pretty damn cool. Much like in the first game, these weapons get put to good use against various dinosaur and alien enemies, with there being much more alien enemies this time around, such as the mantids, blind ones, and dinosaurs, which are humanoid dinosaur-like creatures that seek nothing more but to slaughter humanity. And these enemies are fought across seaports, a medieval-looking city, marshes, cave systems, and alien spaceships. The level design can admittedly be extremely confusing in Turok 2, but more so in levels such as the Lair of the Blind Ones and the Hive of the Mantids. The first two levels can be a bit confusing as well, but the Lair and the Hive really take the cake here for worst level design in the game, and it honestly does drag the experience down a bit. However, I found the level design in the Death Marshes and the Primogen Lightship to be very solid, with the Death Marshes probably being my favorite level, because it is the least confusing to navigate, and you feel like you are constantly pushing forward. It also helps that you get a few of Turok 2's best weapons in this level, which makes the player feel like an absolute force of nature. Each level also ends with a wave-based totem defense sequence that isn't too challenging, but does add some variety to the gameplay. Much like in the first game, enemies will often respawn, but this is made much easier to deal with due to the fact that checkpoints can be located that contain portals to a place where you can restock on health and ammo. The trade-off is that some checkpoints can only be used for this purpose one time, and once you teleport back to the level you are on, most of the enemies have respawned. Overall, I would say that it's a good system and an improvement over the first game, especially since enemies seem to drop ammo more often on the higher difficulties than in the first game. And I don't know if this was something that was added in the remaster, but you can also now save your game at any point, which includes both manual saves and quick saves, which is great to see. It should also be noted that Night Dive Studios, much like with their remaster of Turok 1, did a great job here, arguably an even better job as enemy models seem to have been improved, and the Turok 2 remaster is just an all-around great-looking game. Then there's Turok 3 Shadow of Oblivion. This is certainly the weakest entry in the original trilogy, also the shortest with only a 2 to 3 hour playtime. And while I wouldn't say it's a bad game, it is severely lacking, and I will be getting into why that is. First off, Turok 3 puts a much greater emphasis on story, and this is done through the inclusion of many cutscenes with fully voiced characters. This isn't really a bad thing, but the writing itself is pretty bad at times, as is immediately seen in how Joshua Fireseed, the protagonist from Turok 2, is killed by flesh eaters at the start of the game. From here, you can either play as Joshua's sister Danielle or the brother Joseph. The primary differences between these choices being a few different weapons and some unique traversal options. For instance, Danielle gets a grappling hook and can jump higher, and Joseph gets night vision goggles and can squeeze into tight spaces. Due to the game's linear nature, I didn't really bother to play much as Joseph after my full playthrough with Danielle, but it was cool to see weapons like the Mag 60, double-barreled shotgun, tech bow, grenade launcher, and firestorm minigun make a return. The multi-rocket launcher from Turok 2 is replaced by a standard rocket launcher in this game, which is a bit of a letdown, but it is still fun to use and is pretty powerful, dealing plenty of splash damage. Danielle also gets an awesome assault rifle, which I had a lot of fun using. I did sorely miss the explosive shotgun shells from the previous games, however, and instead there is a separate shotgun that sets enemies on fire. It is effective, but it burns through ammo like crazy. No pun intended. They also included the cerebral bore from Turok 2, but it's just not as good this time around, due to the fact that only one projectile can be active at once, which means that using this thing just devolved to shooting out a projectile, hiding behind cover, and waiting for it to finish killing an enemy before you can use it again. This is just a shame, and I have no idea why they would change how it functions this drastically. But yeah, as I mentioned, this is a very linear game. In fact, I would say that much of the level design is rather boring and lacks any sense of creativity. Sure, the environments do look pretty cool, especially after the excellent job that Night Dive did with this remaster, but for the most part you are just going from point A to point B. Some levels have more open spaces and some very short branching pathways, while others might as well just be a corridor. From what I've heard, there were some changes made to level design in this remaster, and more health and ammo pickups were added as well, which is greatly appreciated. I did enjoy moving through the urban environments early on despite their linearity, mostly due to the fact that this is a major deviation from the environments of the first two games. And these areas even have a very Half-Life 2 vibe to them, 4 years prior to Half-Life 2's release, mind you. There's even a train level during this portion of the game, and I always love to see train levels in first-person shooters.
Warning, track obstruction detected. Warning, automated braking system failure. Engage manual brakes in cockpit immediately. Warning, engine in 30 seconds.
Aside from these urban environments, you do make a return to the original jungle from the Lost Land in the first game, and there is also a government facility that you move through that is very reminiscent of Black Mesa from the first Half-Life. There are lots of different enemy types in this game, and they pretty much boil down to enemies with projectile attacks and enemies with hit scan weapons. I did encounter some issues with the combat, primarily with some inconsistent hit detection, and some enemies deal so much damage to the player that it's kind of ridiculous, at least on hard mode, especially when a lot of these attacks are very difficult to dodge. In fact, I found the boss fights to be the most fair because most of their attacks are easily avoided as long as you are constantly circle strafing and firing on them. The game also has a bit of an inverted difficulty, as I found the early game to be the most difficult, but collecting what were extra life points in the first and second games now boosts your max health by 10 hit points with every 100 that you collect. Therefore, the further you get into the game, the stronger you get, and you also get more weapons as well, while I found the enemies to not really get any more challenging. It's also kind of odd that even with the linear level design, there are a few areas where enemies are constantly respawning, much like in the first two games, but it isn't that fitting in Turok 3, because now there is really no need to fight enemies in these areas at all, so it's better to just run right through. Plus, on a first playthrough, you have no way of expecting what areas will have respawning enemies. I know that I have been pretty negative about Turok 3, but it really is the weakest game in the original Turok trilogy. Despite this, however, and despite a few moments of frustration, I actually did enjoy my time with this game for the most part, and overall I would say that I had fun playing it. Those moments when you are running around gunning down enemy after enemy with the assault rifle are great, and timing your shotgun blast between flesh eater attacks in order to land insta-kill headshots is also fantastically enjoyable. So, that was a look at the classic Turok trilogy, now remastered for the modern day. Looking back on these games, I would have to conclude that there hasn't really been a perfect entry in the series, but if I were to have it my way, I would just want Turok 2 with less confusing level design. But as things stand, Turok 2 is definitely my personal favorite, mostly due to its vast roster of creative weaponry and its over-the-top gore effects. Second place would definitely go to the first game, but I really enjoyed playing through all of these games. As a whole, this is a great boomer shooter trilogy that should be experienced by all fans of first-person shooters. And I can't end this video without stating just how incredibly well Night Dive Studios remastered these three games. Video game preservation is extremely important, and for fans of boomer shooters, Night Dive is a pillar of the community. With that, I will end it, and I would like to give a special thanks to all of my subscribers and anyone who has viewed my videos. If you enjoyed the video, please remember to like and subscribe if you haven't already, and dislike it if you absolutely hated it. As always, enjoy the rest of your day.